I'm Kelsey. This is my channel, The Fancy Hat Lady Reads. I am wearing one of my fancy booktube hats, and today I am bringing you the second part of my February wrap-up. If you may recall, the first part of my February wrap-up was my wrap-up for the things I read for round 2 of the Unicorn Readathon, and I put that in the same video as my TBR for this round 3 of the Unicorn Readathon. Happy National Unicorn Day, by the way! You can check out that video. I will link it for you. I read 5 more things in February, 2 of which I have already done full reviews of, so hopefully this will be pretty quick. The first thing I have to talk about here is one of those ones I've already reviewed, and that is Autonomous by Annalee Newitz. This was a NetGalley arc that I read on my Kindle, and this is a science fiction book set on future Earth that deals with the pharmaceutical industry and artificial intelligence and some pretty big injustices in society. So you can go check out my review. I doubled it up in a double review video with Prime Meridian, which is a novella by Silvia Moreno Garcia. But this book basically has 2 storylines, one of which follows Jack, a pharmaceutical pirate. She is on the run because she reverse-engineered a batch of a drug that went horribly wrong. She wants to reveal to the world that the problem with the drug is the fault of the pharmaceutical company, Zaxi. They, of course, want her stopped at all costs. And then we also follow a bot named Paladin who's paired up with a human agent, Elias, to track Jack down. I've seen this book, I think, improperly described as sort of a fun, exciting romp, and it wasn't that for me. It was actually very slow-paced. It took me a long time to read because the world building was very dense, and the ideas take a long time to come together. I thought it was actually a pretty scary portrait of a future world. So I gave this 4 stars, and if that sort of meaty science fiction standalone story is your thing, you might want to check this out. Again, I will link my review. The next book I read was Wild Beauty by Annalee McLemore. This is a young adult magical realism book. I thought I was going to love this because I loved her previous novel, When the Moon Was Ours. I was not wrong. I absolutely adored this book. I gave it 5 stars. I do sort of still want to do a review of this, but I haven't had time to do it yet. This is about the Nomolovides women, a multi-generational family of cousins. There are 5 of them in each generation. They have the magical power to grow flowers with their hands. They live on this estate called La Pradera that they've turned into these beautiful, beautiful gardens over multiple generations. But they don't own the land. It's owned by the wealthy white Breyer family. The Nomolovides women live here because their family history and legacy is that they've been treated as witches everywhere they've gone. This is the only place that their family has landed to find home. They are now inextricably bound to the land. The land tries to kill them if they leave, and they are considered to be cursed because all of the men they fall in love with inevitably eventually vanish. McLemore's writing focuses a lot on queer representation, though we get to know some of the 5 youngest of the Nomolovides girls better than others. It's at least implied that all of them are bisexual. At the beginning of this book, they have all fallen a little bit in love with the same woman, Bae Breyer. And after making some offerings to the gardens of La Pradera in hopes that it will save Bae from disappearing, a boy appears in the gardens who may come from the past, but he has no memories of his previous life. Yeah, talking about this book now, there's a lot in it that makes me feel like I really do want to do a full review. The writing is gorgeous. It's hard to really talk about the direction this book goes in without spoilers, but it's a lot about multi-generational legacies and relationship with the land, and the stories that get remembered and told about a place. Let me know if you want me to do a full review of this. If you do, I'll prioritize that. Anyhow, like I said, I gave this book 5 stars. I absolutely loved it. The next thing I finished in the month of January was Jackalope Wives and Other Stories by T. Kingfisher, whose pen name for Ursula Vernon. Some of these stories had previously been published under the T. Kingfisher name, and some of them, like the title story, had previously been published under the Ursula Vernon name. So the things that are in this collection are The Kingfisher and the Jackalope, which is just an introduction, Godmother, Jackalope Wives, Wooden Feathers, Editing, Bird Bones, That Time with Bob and the Unicorn, Razorback, The Dryad's Shoe, Let Pass the Horses Black, This Vote is Legally Binding, Telling the Bees, The Tomato Thief, In Questionable Taste, Origin Story, Pocosin, and It Was a Day. Most of these I liked a lot. I had previously read Jackalope Wives. That one and The Tomato Thief, which is its loose sequel, are both available online. I'll link them for you. They're both set in a sort of southwestern setting and center around a character called Grandma Harkin, who is wonderful. She reminds me of the Discworld Witches. In fact, a bunch of these stories had characters that reminded me of the Discworld Witches. That's sort of one of the things I like about Ursula Vernon as an author. Wooden Feathers is about a woman named Sarah who's a wood carver. She makes terribly, horrendously bad duck decoys and eventually learns why this one guy is buying them and what he does with them, and it sort of ends up having a Pinocchio thing going on with it. Editing is just sort of a little ramble about writing. Bird Bones is another story that I really enjoyed. For some reason, birds have all started displaying extraordinary levels of intelligence. And we focus on one old lady who's a bird watcher as she develops a relationship with the birds in her backyard, and then the birds help her defeat a neighborhood threat. That Time with Bob and the Unicorn was maybe my favorite thing in this. It's only like 8 or 9 pages long, 8 pages long. And I have to admit, I did read this multiple times just because I got such a laugh out of it. One of those times I forcibly read it aloud to a friend. It's about things like virginity being a cultural construct and, you know, narwhals being water unicorns. Also, this guy named Bob being an idiot and trying to summon a unicorn. And of course it all leads to an outrageous narwhal rescue. Razorback was one of the 2 stories in here that were a little too dark, bloody, and gruesome for me. The other one being Origin Story. Neither of those were bad stories in many ways. They were both excellent. I just couldn't stomach them. Origin Story was one of the ones that was a new story in this collection in print for the first time. The other one was Let Pass the Horses Black, which I really loved. That is a short Tam Lin retelling with a dark twist. This Vote is Legally Binding is actually a poem, so is It Was a Day. The Dryad's Shoe is a sort of Cinderella retelling as only Ursula Vernon would write it. The Dryad's magic really, really wants Hannah to go to the ball in a pretty dress and marry the prince, but Hannah just wants to stay in the garden and garden. She does not see it as unjust servitude at all. Telling the Bees is super short. It's only like 3 pages long, and it's one that I wouldn't have expected to like because it does have a sort of undead story element going on with it, but I actually thought it was very beautiful and I liked it a lot. The Tomato Thief is probably the longest story in this book. It's a novelette length, which is why I didn't get through it on my computer screen the first time I tried, because that's just too long a story for me to read on my computer screen. And I'm so glad I finally read this because it was wonderful. That is the second Grandma Harkin story that I mentioned earlier. It has a cursed mockingbird woman, it has train gods, and Grandma Harkin is this super magical, compassionate old lady character who saves the day. There's definitely folklore elements in it. I love it. In Questionable Taste was also a poem. This was just one of several bits in here that are sort of like autobiographical descriptions of the creative process. Pocosin was another one with a main character who reminded me a bit of the Discworld Witches, but it wasn't one of the ones that super stood out to me. There was nothing I disliked about it, though. So basically, I think this is a really strong short story collection, and if you like anything by Ursula Vernon / T. Kingfisher, you'll probably like at least some of the stories in this, so I do recommend this. I gave this 4 stars. The next thing I read was another NetGalley arc on my Kindle that I've already reviewed, and that is Moonshine by Jasmine Gower. This is like a 1920s inspired fantasy that's set in a separate fictional world where there's this sort of conservative paranoia against magic, and so there's this underground moonshining industry for mana, which is a substance that gives magicians energy, sort of like the 1920s with prohibition of alcohol. It's about Daisy Dell, a modern young woman with some magical secrets who takes a job as a typist, and some crazy stuff happens. I gave this 3 stars. If you're interested, please check out my review. I thought that the world building was interesting enough that I would read more set in this world if there was going to be more set in this world. It's a very inclusive cast of characters, and there's a sort of found family friendship theme thing going on. I wasn't super invested in the plot, but it was fast-paced enough that it kept me reading and it kept me entertained. And then the last thing I read in February was a graphic novel. This is Spell on Wheels by Kate Leth, Morgan Levens and Marissa Louise. This is a self-contained story in one volume. I don't know if there's going to be any more of this story, but this stands on its own. The art is this sort of straightforward comic style that really isn't my thing, but I still really enjoyed this story. It's about this trio of 20-something girls who are witches who live together in a house like roommates, and their house is broken into and a bunch of their stuff is stolen, their magical stuff, including one very important artifact, and they go on a road trip to hunt down whoever took it by tracing where these stolen artifacts pop up on the black market. We know pretty early on that the guy who broke in and stole this stuff is one of the girls' ex-boyfriend who is, you know, awful in all of the ways. He really thinks that he should have magical powers because his family does and he feels entitled to it. And he's been told by someone who is apparently pulling the strings that if he does this thing, then he will get his magical powers. Whose evil plot this actually is, though, and what they're aiming at with it is not to be revealed until later on. This is another story with a very inclusive cast of characters. Two of these girls are people of color, there's queer representation, and I think what I enjoyed most about this was that this is sort of like being one of a coven of 20-something-year-old witches who, like, maybe disagree sometimes, but ultimately have each other's backs. Like, that's sort of the dream. Like, that is the magical, witchy, girl power dream of my generation. I'm not gonna lie, I would love to have this life. Anyhow, I gave this 4 out of 5 stars. I really enjoyed it. So those were the print books that I read in February, aside from the 3 that I already wrapped up, plus the 2 NetGalley arcs that I've already reviewed. I may yet still do a review of this one. Let me know again if you want that. Let me know if you've read any of these books or if you're planning to. Anyhow, I hope you are having a nice day. That is all. Bye for now.